So I'm going to show you how to edit an image in Photoshop so that we can convert it into a vector image in Illustrator for this next project. So in Photoshop, so make sure you're in Photoshop, I have opened up an image. This is my brother's pug, so this is what I'm going to be using as my base. You're going to open up your picture in Photoshop, and you can either click on the picture and go File Open, or up in Photoshop you can click File Open to open up the image that way. And what we're going to be doing is applying a filter. So you go up to the top, and where it says filter, you're going to drag down to Filter Gallery, and then it becomes full screen. And I'm going to kind of toggle so I can get the full pug in the picture. And then under Artistic, we're going to be using the cutout filter, which automatically blocks it off over here, and you can change the levels over here. I've already tinkered with this, so I know that I want no edge fidelity and I don't want it to be simple, so I'm going to turn those all the way down. And then my number of levels, I'm also going to decrease. Oops, that's not what I wanted. But basically what you want to do is play around with these different settings over here until you get the image that you want, because we're going to be tracing this image into Illustrator to turn it into a full vector file. So I want to kind of stick in this area, which is a 5, and then 2 for edge simplicity and 1 for edge fidelity. And that's because I want to make sure that I get some detail in the legs and in the tail, and particularly in the face. If we block this off too much, like if we go up to it like a 6, well, that looks pretty good. But if we go to a 6, we get more detail in the face, but then less in the tail. So you can kind of pick and choose. So I think 5 is a good balance for that. And then edge simplicity. I mean, it's fur, right? So I want to get the texture of the fur. So I don't want it to be, too much texture, but I want it to be a little bit. So I think 2 is kind of the perfect spot. And then edge fidelity, again, I don't want it to be super rough. I want it to be a little bit on the smooth side. So for me, a 1 is a good place to kind of sit. But play around with these different levels. Every image is going to be different. Just make sure you have details where you want them. So for me, particularly, I wanted the tail, the legs, and the face to make sure that they had appropriate amount of detail. And then you hit OK, and it applies it to your image. And then all I need to do to prepare it to go into Illustrator is to save it as. And I'm going to save it as my last name. I know how to spell. My first name, and then this is my pug base. I'm gonna call this the base, and I'm gonna save it on my desktop as a JPEG, and then hit save. And then make sure that the quality is set all the way to maximum, and then OK. And that is what you need to do to prepare it to go into Illustrator. Okay, so once we have our image prepped in Photoshop and ready to go, bring it into Illustrator, I went ahead and I made a new Illustrator document that is just letter sized, standard. And then I'm going to find my image, which is my base image, and I'm going to drag and drop it onto that plain white document. And you can see that this image is much larger than the piece of paper that I need to place it on. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and making sure that I'm on the black arrow, I'm going to hold down Shift and drag it to make it smaller, so that I can fit inside of my sheet of paper right here. And I can always change this later. Like if I want to make it larger to fill up more of the paper, I can do that at a later point. But for now, I just want to fit it inside of the paper. And I'm going to go to my layers and lock that layer in place, because I'm not going to want to mess with it later. Again, if you cannot see your layers button over here, you go up to Window and you can find your layers right here, or the quick key is F7. So now that my picture is in place and ready to go, I'm going to make a new layer by clicking the little icon that looks like a Post-it note. And I'm going to zoom in nice and close, because I'm going to want to work on this in pieces, because it's just going to be easier. And it depends where you want to start. I'm going to want to start, I think, with the hat, the little sombrero of the hat. And I'm going to want to label my layers so that way I know what I'm working on. This is going to be particularly important later, because there's going to be so many colors and so many pieces. It's going to just make your life easier if all of these layers are labeled. So layer 1 I can leave because I know that's my image layer. And then layer 2, I'm just going to rename it to be hat so that I can go ahead and start tracing. So we're going to be utilizing the eyedropper tool, which if you click on it, automatically picks the color for you. And then the easiest way to go about this is you're using the pen tool. You're going to switch it over so that the color that you've selected is the fill. I'm sorry, is the stroke instead of the fill. And this is the hardest part, honestly, is we're going to be needing to, instead of, let me think of how to say this clearly. We're going to trace all of these little pieces, but since there's so many little pieces, instead of making individual shapes, I'm going to make one large shape that I can then build on top of, because I don't want any gaps in my final product. And then again, make sure that you make a total complete shape. So that is my base. So I'm going to turn it onto my base, and I can hit the drop down so I can unseat that base. And then from there, I can use the eyedropper tool to then do these smaller little bits of color. And then for those, I can make them slightly larger shapes. And we can zoom in on these and make them nice and close. And I forgot to switch it over to stroke instead of fill. And I'm just doing this very quickly just so you kind of get a sense for what's going on. And then when I turn that background on, you can kind of imagine how I'm going to start to layer all of this together. So I just really quickly want to go over utilizing the layers and the pattern, and the order that they are in so that it makes your life easier. So what I have done is I started off with making one giant shape that was my base color, and then I started filling in all of the smaller shapes of color on top of that. So remember, we're alternating using the eyedropper tool to select the color and then using the pen tool to draw the shape of that color. But what I want to point out is sometimes it's difficult to realize which color is the largest area, then which one is the smallest, and then it can get very confusing. So I want to highlight a couple of little features. So whenever you click on a shape, so whatever shape that you've clicked on, it gets highlighted by a little box here in your layers palette. And then you can also drag and rearrange these shapes. So when I originally made this shape, it was underneath this, which is obviously not what I want. And so I can just click on this shape, and again I can click on it and it gets highlighted here in my layers palette, and I can move that all the way to the top because I know that it needs to be on the top of everything. And then I can kind of go back in and like filter things through. So like these are, you know, similar colors, but maybe one's darker, and I can rearrange it to the back. And then that's a good way to, like, you see how this shape is it covers a large area. So it doesn't matter if you do it later or beforehand, you can always go back in and fill it in accordingly, as long as you just organize your shapes correctly over here in your palette. And then the other thing that is nice is every time you make a new layer, Illustrator automatically assigns it a color. So if I'm clicking and trying to realize like where, like if I want to move this shape, where do I find that shape? It's always highlighted, and then the outline is red, so I know I go to the red layer, and there's always a box next to the layer that I've selected, and even it indicates that it's selected. So then I can just drop down in it and then find the red square to know that this is the shape that needs to get moved and rearranged. So it's little things, but definitely it's easy, but you have to be vigilant and organized when working on this project. Okay, last little tidbit before we get started. So I've started working on my hat, and I want to check my progress because it looks like I have things filled in, everything's all lined up, everything looks fine with the picture still in the background. Make sure that you unsee the background photo so you can see where these little gaps are. The end product, we don't want any gaps. So if you use the white arrow and you click on the shape that you made, you can reactivate these anchor points. The key is that you have to click on the anchor point a second time, and that's when the handlebars will show up. And then from there, you can adjust that so that you fill in those gaps. Now, as long as you move your anchor points and it's behind something else, it doesn't matter where they go. It's just we only care about what we can visibly see. So if it's tucked behind another shape, it's easy to fill it in. Same with this shape up here. So we're just going to click the anchor point. We're going to drag it down. It's underneath of this shape. So it doesn't matter that it didn't line up per se to like the original source. And then I want to move this over as well because this goes all the way to the edge. And it looks like I kind of tucked it in. So don't be afraid to fine tune all of your little points using the white arrow, and then don't be afraid to zoom in real close to fix any sort of little gap or mistake that you may have made from the first pass. So we can fill that in. We can close this gap here. We can, oops, so see I didn't click on the anchor point again, and so it moved the entire shape. So just make sure that you just lightly touch on those anchor points before you move them so you fill in those gaps. Okay, so keep working.